Three, two, one, action. And we're live. Hi, Luca.
Hi, John.
How's it going?
It's going really well, thank you. On a personal level, it's going really well. State of the country, it's struggling a bit, but I suppose that's what we're here to talk about.
Yes, that's right. And obviously, for listeners, John is my pseudonym. Um, I'm not yet out, as it were, but Luca is. So, Luca, some of you might know from the Amiable Arguments podcast, and I was a guest on the show perhaps a year or two ago at this point. And we had a good conversation. We talked about a few things. And so today we are having a conversation about the absolute state of everything. So, where do we even start?
Literally everything. You know what? I think that we should actually start with what happened last night. Because I actually feel like, in a way, what happened last night at the last night of the proms really articulates it all in it's almost like the perfect storm of everything come together. I actually recently wrote an article about the proms because I've enjoyed going to them now for a number of years since I moved to London. And what's been very clear over those few years, ever since 2020, is that slowly but surely those who get a kick out of desecrating our culture, out of profaning it and subverting it, they're getting bolder, and they feel that there are bigger and bigger prizes and targets and scalps that they're able to claim now that perhaps 5 years ago they wouldn't have dared to have gone for. And I think the Proms is a great example of this.
Well, let's start there because I haven't even heard about what's happened this year. I'm familiar with things that have happened in previous years. I know that certain songs were tarnished, were accused of having connotations that meant that they didn't want us to sing them anymore, and then there was a sort of a public backlash against that. But what happened at this year's proms?
So it's quite strange, really. I actually tried yesterday morning to get tickets to go to it because I've just always wanted to go to the last night at proms. What, self-respecting Brit wouldn't want to go there and, have a sing to Rule Britannia and a good old stamped pomp and circumstance. But essentially what happened was I didn't get tickets, so I just watched it from home, and I saw it on the TV. And what became so apparent is you will turn on the TV, and everywhere the camera pans is just a sea of EU flags in the auditorium. So that's number one. The fact that obviously the proms is set at the Royal Albert Hall, which is in London, and London is obviously a very Europhilic city, and voted overwhelmingly to remain in the EU. And obviously, the people in London feel like it's a good opportunity to get on national television and show some solidarity with this bloc that they have some twisted infatuation with. But the other thing as well is that the conductor stopped halfway through to give a very deeply stunning and incredibly brave speech, talking about the power of diversity and inclusion and women's rights and women being conductors and all things. But it was just, you can tell when the camera pans to the faces of some of the people in the audience, there's just a look of utter confusion as to why this is being talked about. They just came here to have a sing song. Why are we being lectured? But this is just, as I say, the perfect example, really, of what we've had to endure for years and year in now.
Oh, I mean, if you had been able to see my face at that point, you would have seen a similar look of, you know, not just confusion, but more of a kind of a grimace of, oh God. I mean, it's just, you
Mm.
never get a moment It's like they constantly want to
It's
ride it down your
relentless.
throat, and there's nowhere that you can go really to escape from it anymore. So they had EU flags for last night of the proms during Royal Britannia.
Yes, which don't get me wrong, there is obviously a slight bit of humour in that. Watch all these. It's like, okay, well, you're there now in the proms with your EU flags. Go on, do it. Go on, do it. Sing Rule Britannia.
Now, were people
It's
waving these
like,
flags?
but yes, passionately. Don't get me wrong, there were a lot of Union Jacks there as well.
Okay.
Point is that if you go back and look at the proms and clips from the last night from say 2012 or 2009, there is not one to be found. It's just a sea of Union Jacks across the board. Obviously, we were in the EU then, so it would have felt a bit weird to have waved the EU flag back then because it wasn't really a something that was really in the mainstream public debate at the time. UK had the establishment had thought that the UK had simply settled into its place in this new European hegemonic, state taking its diktats from Brussels, and that was that, and it was all done. But you can see here that really, even though we get more and more distance between us and the vote to leave the EU, the argument hasn't gone away. And really, what's happening is the Remainers are just biding their time, and they haven't dumbed down any of their zealotry. They're just a lot smarter about where they voice it now.
Mm. And you know what's really interesting about that is that for me, that brings me back to the beginning of my journey. So, back
Mm.
in 2015, I was a Green Party voting, Guardian reading, nominally left wing, just kind of default. Yeah, feminism is great. Socialism would probably be good if we could just be a bit nicer. Um, and and then it was the Brexit vote that was the first thing that really made me sort of sit up and actually start paying attention to politics, because what was really
Mm.
shocking, I suppose, at the time, and unsettling, was the fact that after the vote had been taken, people kept arguing about it. And I couldn't quite get my head around this because, before the vote, it was all very, you know, it all seemed to be the usual thing of, well, we're just trying to understand what this is about and make a good decision in good faith. Some people feel one way, some people feel another way. There doesn't seem to be an awful lot in it. We're not really sure why we're doing this, but okay, let's think about it. Personally, at the time, I voted to remain. I couldn't really see the point of leaving. Um, but then it was after that that on social media, particularly on Facebook, I noticed that people wouldn't let it go. And that seemed odd to me because I'd always thought that the point of democracy is that we agree that we'll vote on it, and that means that we'll abide by the results of that vote. And yet, people on the other side, although, sorry, I should say people who at the time were on my side, just wouldn't let it go. And I just saw people, weeks went by, months went by, and people were still arguing about it. And I couldn't understand that, just seemed off. It seemed unnatural. It seemed weird. And for me, that was the first step on my journey of going from a normie, a person who just doesn't really pay attention to politics and isn't that interested, to everything that I have learned since, and all the ways in which my perspective has changed. And I think that's always been the strange thing about Brexit, that zealotry that you mentioned. It just seems that there was something that changed. I mean, what would you say, Luca? Do you have a sense of what it was that was different about the Brexit vote?
I think I do in some ways. I think what Brexit represented in many ways, was an enormous threat to the narrative. I think there was a sense before Brexit that, generally speaking, we'll keep voting Labour or we'll keep voting Conservative, but generally speaking, things will just keep chugging on in a direction that we don't really agree with, but honestly, we don't feel like we have an awful lot of say over. And I think that really what Brexit represented was a wake up call to a lot of the very content middle class intelligentsia that actually their sort of Whig history view of the world, that, because the European Union to them just represented the natural progression of the next phase of Europe, the European story. The 21st century would be defined by European integration. Um, and obviously the erosion of the national identities into this United States of Europe. And the shock of being halted squarely in their tracks by 17.4 million people who don't read The Guardian was just too much for them to compute, really. But also, I think there was one time I was arguing with my lecturer about this when I was back at drama school when the vote was going on, and she was an absolute radical for the EU, an absolute radical, and still is, would more than happily overturn it to this day. But one of the things that I said to her is that, well, you're just, all it is you're kind of arguing um, you're arguing on different moral wavelengths, because all she would talk about would be freedom of movement and the economy. And I'm talking about it from a position of culture and sovereignty and self determination. And what I was trying to appeal to her with simply didn't matter. And what she was trying to appeal to me with simply didn't matter to me. And so there's very little room for reconciliation within this debate over the EU still, because fundamentally, what the two sides are advocating for are absolutely diametrically opposed in terms of the grand narrative of what Britain's place is in Europe for all of posterity after this.
Hmm. Yeah, and I suppose the thing that really stands out to me that's different about the Brexit election, I suppose, is the fact that there seemed to be this crack that formed in social groups that I was a part of. That societal rift between people on one side and people on the other. I feel like that was the first time I came into contact, and so I've wondered whether or not I just wasn't paying attention and didn't care about politics enough to have noticed this before, or whether there really something that changed in the whole zeitgeist, if you like. And I think there was something that changed there, because it carried on in American politics in the election between Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton. And that was another one where, it just seemed like suddenly there was this disagreement between people, which was no longer a disagreement amongst friends. It was a we are falling out over this kind of disagreement. It was a we can't reconcile this. And
Mm.
it was really unsettling in the same way to see that happen in America, because, and again, I started out sympathetic to the anti-Trump side of things. I started out thinking, of course, this is absurd. There's no way America can do this. Donald Trump isn't a politician. Like, this doesn't make sense to me. But also, I found it really strange, again, that there was this sudden change of tone where we went from, well, this is a democracy and we take votes about things, and, if your side loses, well, too bad. We agree that those are the rules, and if you lose fair and square. If you win fair and square. And it seemed like with both Brexit and the election of Donald Trump, this was the point in Britain and then in America, which you kind of think of that as the centre of the West, or at least I do, that seemed like where that was the point where everything seemed like it started to go off the rails.
Yes, I think so. Particularly when you look at so much of the culture wars has been accelerated since Brexit. The attacks on our heritage, on our history, on our culture, on our traditions, all of this has been enormously accelerated by Brexit. It does feel in every way that we are continually being punished for daring to choose our own destiny in many ways. I think that the thing that's most important, though, about what you were saying here about Trump and about Brexit, I think what it really what was most important, particularly about Brexit and the details of that, was the shocking revelation after we won that the government, that David Cameron's government, had absolutely no contingency plan for what would happen if the Leave vote won. And what that tells us is that essentially it wasn't supposed to happen. And they didn't plan for it happening because they were essentially 100% sure that it wasn't going to happen. And what that means, by further extension, is that you could give the people an in out referendum that you were 100% sure that your side was going to win in order to make people believe that they lived in the democracy, when in fact you merely live in the illusion of a democracy. Because Brexit was completely unperturbed by any sort of hurdles, such as first past the post or anything like that that normally exists within our daily political system. It was a simple one person, one vote. Whoever comes out with more votes wins. And we did that. And as I say, the fact that the government did not plan for it, genuinely did not foresee that happening, I think speaks to it really puts into stark light just how little hand the people of this country have actually had on their own nation for decades and decades now.
Yeah. Well, what's interesting to me about that, though, Luca, is it seems to me that they, in both Brexit and the election of Donald Trump, um, as you say, the other side were completely convinced that they would win. And I almost wonder if the fact that both of those elections then went the other way illustrates that perhaps we did still have some semblance of democracy, at least at that time. And that perhaps was the point at which the powers that be realized that democracy was no longer safe. And I wonder if what had changed around that time was social media. I think Facebook and Twitter and other ways of people communicating through online platforms at that point. That was probably earlier in the stage of social media compared to where we are now, where they hadn't quite grasped the influence that that would have and how that would help the people who disagreed with them to put forward the other side of the argument. And I think both for Donald Trump and for Brexit, that was the thing they didn't count on. They didn't count on the fact that suddenly social media had given a voice to the people who previously were unable to get their message out there. And I think that is what put the fear of God in them. And it's also, if we fast forward a little bit, I think people who see the world as we do and have probably witnessed certain more recent elections and are of the same opinion about the veracity of those elections. We see these elections being fortified, as it were. This is a meme which, for anyone listening who doesn't know the backstory of that, perhaps we can leave a link to kind of tell people the backstory another time. It's a bit too much of a tangent now. But yeah, I think that's the point at which the powers that be realized that what had worked to shepherd the flock in the direction they wanted and to vote the way that they wanted them to vote was no longer working. And so they then had to up their game and step things up and start using other methods to make sure that the democratic system, such that it is, still produced the results that they wanted to be produced.
It's remarkable, though. I keep coming back to Brexit just because it's obviously more relevant to us as Brits, although the Trump thing is obviously enormously important. But the thing is about Brexit as well, that it wasn't a large margin of victory. It was just enough to get a majority over the threshold. But the thing that's important about that is that if the established powers in the decade before that referendum, in 2016, if say, for a decade before that, but in both, Blair, Brown, and Cameron, in those years, if those established powers had been willing to give any conciliations and had been prepared to give an inch to the general demands of the populace, to have, if they'd have just lowered immigration like we'd asked them to, if they'd have just tightened up our borders a little bit, if they'd have held their shoulders back just a little bit more and spoken a little bit more proudly of our culture, then if they'd have given those, then I don't think we would have got Brexit. But refusing to give anything, they made us resort to the most radical option and the most useful tool that we had at our disposal to hurt them and scream at them and plead with them to finally listen to our appeals. And remarkably, or maybe not remarkably, depending on if you're a cynic, since that referendum, those very problems that we were complaining about, none of them have been mitigated and all of them have been accelerated.
Yes, I can imagine many people who have been paying attention from that point may have started to lose faith in democracy. I certainly have. And it's very sad to see, because it was something that I think we all valued quite a lot as we grew up, this idea that we live in a democracy, that we live in a country where we're actually involved in the process. We have a say in the process, and we have a set of rules. We play by the rules, and if the majority of people agree with something, that's how we make a decision. And I was bought into this, as I think a lot of people were. But then to see, on the one hand, that we get to a point where people are no longer abiding by the vote, and they will just argue it and argue it, and they will die on that hill, that they're just not going to accept the outcome of the democratic election, on the one hand. And then on the other hand, you see that where a democratic result has been, has come down on the side that the powers that be don't want it to, they're just not going to do it. And it's going to be fought the whole way. And with Brexit, as we've seen, it was fought tooth and nail to get to anything like what we wanted it to be. With Donald Trump, he may have had some ideas, but the bureaucracy in the United States equally seemed to be doing everything it could at every point to stop anything that he was trying to enact from actually coming to pass. And so that is the thing, I think, that kind of made me question democracy just as a concept overall. Obviously, more recently, I've read certain books, The Populist Delusion by Nima Parvini being a great example, where he pulls together the ideas of a lot of the classic Italian elite theorists and others who have criticized the very concept of democracy. I'd very much recommend that book to anyone listening. It's a great way to just kind of, if you're still someone who is bought into the idea of democracy, I'm not saying you should drop that idea, What I'm saying is that if you listen to these views, you may find that you start to see it differently, and that the reasons given for why democracy doesn't really work are quite compelling, and make more sense of what has actually happened in the real world. So where were we? We were talking about how Brexit and then the Trump vote basically divided the country. Lots of
And
countries.
actually, ironically, seems to have exacerbated our problems, accelerated. The immigration has accelerated. The tearing down of our traditions has
Mm,
accelerated. Everything that we fought to prevent has actually been accelerated.
yeah.
And this shows us two things, which is that one, we are genuinely being maliciously punished by those in power, by the Conservative government, because they're not idiots. That they know what they're doing.
Mm,
These are some of the best educated people in the country, and we have shouted loud enough for them to have heard us. And so it's simply a matter that they have heard us and are choosing to ignore us,
okay.
essentially.
Well, let's just pause a moment there, Luca, because I think for some people listening, and I always have the idea that I would like a conversation like this to be accessible to anyone coming into it. So I want to acknowledge the fact that the moment we start to speak about immigration in a skeptical tone or something we're opposed to, a lot of people are going to have the initial kind of moral intuition that there's something wrong with this, because you will have heard from so many sources, especially in the mainstream media, and everyone you know, quite possibly, or many people you know, a lot of people will say that any opposition to immigration means that the person is a racist. It means that they harbour bigotry and prejudice, and that they are a narrow minded person. They're a person who is xenophobic, as in they just don't like people from other countries. They just have this as a prejudice. And they're just not very nice people. They're stubborn. And all of these ideas, and I know this because this is where I came from as someone who grew up very much in a kind of, not far left, but the kind of the default of someone growing up in Brighton, in the 2000s. Okay. So I just want
Thoughts
to
and
say I
prayers.
understand where they're coming from. So I think, Luca, perhaps a good place to try, if those people are open to just hearing, even if only for the sake of understanding why we really oppose this and what we really say, so that they can better refute our arguments. If not that they're going to change their mind, but for anyone who's listening to this with an open mind and coming from that position, I think it would be really helpful if we just lay out, from our point of view, why are we opposed to immigration? What are the reasons for that? And answer the question whether or not they believe what we say, or they just want to stick to, oh, they're just racist, they're just saying it. If they want to think that, that's fine. But for the record, why do we oppose immigration?
Okay, so I think the first point to make about this is that from my own point of view, I have shifted my opinion a lot on this myself. I I have always been and still am to this day of the opinion that there are almost 200 countries in the world, and that if someone wants to pack their suitcases and fly out on the plane with their family to find a better life somewhere, then it is amongst the highest compliments to your country in the world that it could be that of all the countries in the world, that family chose to come to yours. That is the place that they most thought, that is where I could call home if my own country has failed me. That is true, and I think I will always believe that to be true, because it is a compliment, a sincere and heartfelt compliment. There is, however, at its heart, and it's a very, very deep subject matter, but essentially we have an enormous problem in the sense that ever since 1997, when Tony Blair started mass immigration, and very much slackened our border and our visa applications and how many people could come a year. On a societal level, our infrastructure cannot handle the amount of people who have now come here in the past 20 years, more than 20 years now, sorry, in the past, or well, getting on for, 25 years. That's one thing. Our trains, our undergrounds, our public services, the NHS, they cannot cope with the housing, cannot cope with the demand of people coming. That's one thing. Now, there is within that an argument to be made that, well, then this is a result of Tory austerity. If they'd only have built better, built more, if we'd have built more houses, if we'd have, invested in our infrastructure, then we'd have been able to handle all of this. But within this, I think the fault in this argument as well is actually also where we bring in the cultural aspect of this challenge, which is that when you have 10 people, an arbitrary number that I've just picked out, move to a country, then it is such a minimal amount of people that simply requires their assimilation. Because if they don't assimilate into the culture, then they will feel like outcasts and outsiders. And also, you will want to be a part of that sense of community that you can see happening around you. But when numbers become so high, essentially what happens is they will just bring their own cultures from somewhere else and plant that culture like a ghetto in the middle of a town or city or wherever it might be. And the reason that this is a problem from a native perspective is that, one, this is your country, and it is always the custom that the guest obviously does things in the person's home as the person would wish them to be done in their home. It's their home. You don't walk into someone's house and immediately start complaining about how much you hate their wallpaper and how their sink doesn't work very well. You very politely, say thank you for being let in and enjoy the hospitality. But I think that what we're having now is the rise of immigration has been so rapid that we're starting to see the balkanization of Britain. And so that it will get to the point where people in Birmingham have absolutely no affinity or sense of community or connection with the people living in Norwich. And the people in Norwich will have absolutely no connection to those living up in Newcastle, and so on and so forth, because all of the cultures will be different and no one will agree on anything. And so the culture, the monoculture, is the soup that binds us all together.
Hmm. Yeah, and I think, I wonder for people listening how I'm just trying to remember how I came to change my mind about these things. And it was a slow process, and it took a long time to kind of verify the new pieces of information that I came across in this journey. Because a lot of it really hinged on learning about things that I had been kept ignorant of purely by the fact that the media that I consumed in, the form of The Guardian and the BBC, what was on television, what people talked about, just didn't mention these things that are happening. So I want to suggest to people that if it's the case that people who are concerned about and oppose mass immigration are racists, that means that their complaint about it revolves around the fact that the people coming into the country are of a different racial background. And that's why they're really upset. At the heart of it, they just don't like people who are from a different race. So what I want to suggest to people is, okay, let's not even attack that argument. Let's just put that to one side and consider whether there are other reasons for which people might object to immigration that are completely separate from the question of a person's race and that would apply regardless of what ethnic or racial background a person was coming from. So I just want to suggest some of these to people listening. So the first one you might want to think about is, and these are some things that Luca mentioned actually, I think housing is one that I think will resonate with a lot of people. Now, I'll explain how this applies, how we get to housing being a problem to do with this. But I know that people of our generation are struggling to afford a house, to get a mortgage. It's gone from being, the expected thing that one day you would be able to grow up and have a job and buy a house, to that becoming, an aspirational goal akin to being a millionaire. And in so many cases, it's the same thing because houses often cost well over £1 million for just a basic house. We're not talking about a massive, palace, a sort of MTV Cribs sort of situation. Just even purchasing a 2-bedroom flat. I mean, I know people who are earning significantly more money than I'm on, and I know that I earn considerably above the national average. And these are people who are being turned down for a mortgage and can't buy a house. Now, what has this got to do with immigration? Well, if we think about the economics of the situation, economics 101, the price of any commodity is dependent on supply and demand. So if you increase the demand for something, which means there are more people who want it, relevant to the amount of it that there is, then those people will bid the price up. Another way to think about this is, why does a Rolex cost so much money? And why can you not even buy one if you go into a Rolex shop? It's because of scarcity. It's because more people want it than there are the things to go round. And so the problem with mass immigration is that over the last 30 or 40 years, the population of this country has increased, and I believe it's over 20 million.
Yes, it's about that.
And it's important to note for people considering this that increase has not at all come from an increase in the population of the native white British population, the English, the Irish, the Scottish, the Welsh, the Cornish, if they want to be separate. It's not. And actually, if you look at the fertility rates, the indigenous British peoples have very low fertility, which means we're not having enough children so that our population numbers will stay the same over time. We're actually having so few children per person that the population is going down, it's contracting. Now, that would of itself mean that housing should be more affordable now, which would be great because we'd be able to buy houses. But it's not. It's astronomically expensive. And there are multiple factors that affect this. Foreign investment is undoubtedly one of them. But a driving factor is simple economics 101, supply and demand. If you increase the demand for a commodity which is finite, and housing, although housing has been, people are still building houses, there are a lot of limitations to how many houses can be built. That means that the price is going to go up. And that is the same regardless of which racial background the people come from. So I hope that people listening can see that you can object to the government allowing millions of people to come into the country regardless of their race and not be a racist, because your objection has nothing to do with their racial or ethnic background at all. It has to do with the fact that these people moving here means that you are now going to struggle to buy a house, which means that you are now going to struggle, say, if you want to start a family and raise children, you're going to struggle to do that because it's difficult for you to put a roof over their heads because you can't afford the roof. So that's just one example. Luca, perhaps do you have any thoughts on that, or would you want to add to that at all?
I would only say that I think the most pertinent thing to add as well is that often this gets framed as a sense that, oh, well, you just criticizing the immigrants for wanting to come here and have a better life, and that's not actually the case. When you really stop and think about the way that we're framing the argument here, our qualms are not with the immigrant. Our qualms are with our own government. This is not a critique of immigrants as human beings who have a right to dignity and who are, people. It's actually a critique of government policy and the failure of our own government that is mandated to serve our interests, And our interests include, as you say, making sure that when you turn up to the NHS, that the waiting rooms aren't full and you're sat in there with 9 hours in there for 9 hours waiting, so that you are, as you've just gone into in brilliant detail about the housing situation and all of these sorts of things. So these are genuine economic principles that our own government's policy is standing in the way of people born in this country having a better life, of having the good life, a life that their own parents and grandparents were able to have, and that in our generation, these successive governments have taken away from us.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, Luca. And so hopefully anyone listening to this can see that even if they still harbour the suspicion that the people who have these concerns might also be racists, hopefully they can see that there is, at least we've established one legitimate complaint people can have that has nothing to do with race. And so it is possible, at least, that some people who are concerned about mass immigration are not racists. Now, there are some other reasons that people living in Britain, the indigenous Brits, if we can call them that, might object to mass immigration as well. Now, Luca mentioned the NHS, and I think that's another one where, whilst you can point out that many people who work for the NHS have come from other countries, were born in other countries, and are immigrants, you can't really admit that without admitting that a very large number of the people who are drawing down from the NHS not only are immigrants, but are also people who have come to this country coming in at a point, if you imagine the sort of socioeconomic ladder, they're coming at a point where they haven't paid into this collective pot that provides for the NHS and provides healthcare for those who need it. They haven't paid into this system. And many of them are actually coming in and immediately drawing down on other pots, on benefits, on housing. A lot of these people are coming straight into the country and being given free money and accommodation. And again, this is something where it would be true regardless of the ethnic background of those individuals who've come in and are taking from a pot into which they haven't contributed. It's perfectly reasonable to say, look, whatever their background is, these people haven't contributed, and there are people in Britain who are equally, if not more, in need of that help. There are people who are very badly off. There are veterans who are in need of this kind of support. There are single mothers. There are all sorts of people who you could argue are have more right to this, are more entitled to this, morally speaking, because at least they and their families have been living here for a long time, and this is our country. The people who live here have collectively been paying into this pot. And so again, you can see that there are reasons why, whilst immigration benefits the immigrants who come into this country, if they want to have a better life, they may benefit from that. To a certain extent, I hope that people will grant that this can come at the cost of the indigenous population of the country. Now, for those who are already doing well in the country, maybe it's not going to impact them so much. But for people who are struggling to have suddenly all of this extra competition for resources, and this includes extra competition for jobs, it can make a really big difference. It can make life much more difficult for these people. And just one thing that occurs to me, and then I'll turn it back over to you, Luca. something that I noticed during this kind of awakening that I've had was I noticed left wing comedians smugly belittling the working class who complained that immigrants were coming over here, taking our jobs, coming over here, taking our jobs. And I just think there's something so disgusting about the way in which the lives of working class British people, the challenges that they face already, being compounded by mass immigration of people competing for the same jobs, competing for the same resources, making their lives more difficult. The fact that not only do left wing comedians, discount this, but they mock them, they spit in their faces. It's something that I became aware of. Middle class bigotry against the working class. And I suppose they might say I'm something of a class traitor for pointing this out. It's something that I came to find disgusting, and I still do, because it's very easy for and I'm thinking of a few individuals. I don't want to say any names, but probably who I'm talking about, coming over here, taking our jobs.
Mm.
Well, what if they are though? And what if that person then doesn't have that job? And you think that's funny? You think that's funny? You want to mock them? You want to spit on them and belittle them from your, dare I use the word privileged position? I think it's fair to use that, given that you should hold people to their own standards, and the left wing people always talk about privilege. Well, I think it's an incredibly privileged thing for left wing comedians, and Guardianistas in general, to, as they do, spit on and look down on and condescend to the working class over these issues. So that's just something I wanted to sort of point out. But anyway, Luca, I've been talking for a long time, so I'll kick it over to you.
No, you make some exceedingly good points. I would just say on that matter of privilege as well, that also, so I do, sort of come from a sort of more working class background. I grew up in a very sort of poor northern town, and although I don't want to go into it too much, obvious about my personal stuff, but obviously those were the very earliest circumstances into which I was born into, and I just think that there are people around me in my community that I've known and who have grown up there, and without a word of consent have seen everything around their community change. They have, without moving anywhere their entire lives, it somehow feels like they've moved to the other side of the world. And I think that this is what draws them into stark contrast with these, as you say, left-wing comedians, because invariably these people live in places that haven't been affected by those changes. Invariably they live up in the whitest parts of London, like Hampstead, and they don't understand the fact that for ordinary people up and down this country, this isn't a game and this isn't a joke. It might be a joke if it's in the live at the Apollo, but the fact of the matter is that for decade upon decade now, these working class people have been spat upon and ridiculed. And this comes back to what I was saying about Brexit. If they had only chosen to listen with genuine concern to these communities of working class people, then they would still have their precious EU. They would still have all of the things going for them that they actually wanted. But they chose, as I said before, to ridicule and to mock and to disparage and to use a slew of pejoratives to dismiss our concerns. And I think that this really demonstrates the fact that essentially they see us as relics of an old world. I read a book a few years ago when it took off, called Why I'm No Longer Speaking to White People About Race by the critical race theorist Renee Edu Lodge. And she has a chapter on this question of race and class. And the most incredible admission takes place in that book, which is essentially we don't need to worry about these traditional white working class Brits, because you see things have changed now, and we're not living in the 1960s anymore. We're living in the 2010s as it was when it was written, and minorities are the new working class now. We are the working class now. We are the oppressed. We are the marginalized, and it's us that you need to listen to. Don't listen to these bricklayers in Yorkshire and these, farmers, or maybe not farmers, but you know what I mean. Just sort of the everyman who has like a settled presence here. No, you listen to us now. It's our concerns that you march to, and you can see this happening visibly as the days go on.
And I think that's such a startling admission from people on that side. And I think it's one that has always struck me when I've seen people who don't come from this country, who have moved here, and who then speak to us as though they are one of us, and as though they're in a position to tell us what to do and who to value. And in particular, with what we're talking about here, that we should listen to them and care about them more than we should about our own people. Now, this gets into the question of identity and group identity, which is to say, well, who am I as a native of this country? What is my national identity? Am I English? Am I British? What makes a person English? What makes a person British? Now, these people seem to be taking the position that they now, simply because they have obtained British citizenship from the British government, and they have, the legal right to stay here, they seem to be acting as though that means that they are British, and that's all there is to it. That they are now one of us, and we should treat them just the same as we should treat everyone else. Now, a lot of people might think, well, shouldn't we? I mean, are you saying we should have different laws, different standards, different, should we discriminate? Well, of course we shouldn't discriminate. Well, that's not really what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that I think it's a bit rich for people to come here and then immediately, once they've got their citizenship, or perhaps even before, to turn around and presume to tell us that we should care more about them and their own special interest groups than we do about our own people and our own culture. And I think the thing to illustrate is that there is a conflict of interests between groups where they clash. If you have a conflict in a country between people who want to do something that is culturally of the indigenous people, and you have people who have recently moved there, say from various Muslim ethnic backgrounds, and they want to do something different, there can be a conflict of interests. Now, if you just say that, well, a Muslim living in Britain is a British person and that's all there is to it, then you can't take into account the fact that they tend to act in their own group's best interests. They tend to identify as a Muslim first and as a British citizen second. And so the problem there is that if you don't acknowledge the fact that these people come from a different background, and that in their core identity, they identify as a Muslim or as something else other than as a British person, as an English person, say. If you don't take that into account, then you are enabling a double standard. And if you think that that will not be taken advantage of, then I'm sorry, you haven't been paying attention. And so I think that double standard is... the double standard is what I wanted to highlight there. But you go on, Luca.
Oh, well, all I was going to say was that the perfect example of this brings us right back to the start of this conversation with the proms last night. Okay? So The lead celloist who performed last night is a young gentleman called Sheku Kana Mason. His father was British, and his mother was from Sierra Leone. Okay, but he was born here. He was born in Nottingham. He's 24, and this is where his life has been. This is his upbringing. He graduated from one of our most prestigious music conservatoires in London, and he's played countless performances all over the world, and he's already got an MBE at the age of 24. That is a tremendous amount that this country has given him and that he has worked for. Absolutely granted. And despite my animosity against him for his political opinions, that doesn't take. I want to be a big enough man to say he played masterfully last night when I saw him on the TV. He really did. It was a stunning performance. But here's the thing. So he comes from a dual sort of identity background, and he says in the press rounds leading up to his performance at the last night at the proms that he doesn't understand why Rule Britannia is so important to people. Now, that is not our fault. It's not on us to have to explain and defend and justify every single one of our traditions from people who have not necessarily been born fully into them, or maybe have a separate sense of identity from somewhere else. And you can see this, that as the demographics are changing, as you say, with the sense of who are we? Are we British? Are we English? What does it mean? Who are we? What does it mean to be English or British in the 21st century? More and more, what it means to be British is to just sort of roll over and softly accept that everywhere else other than Britain has more of a moral claim to your institutions than you do.
And I just want to interject there, Luca, because I completely agree with you. But I think the thing that is so comically ironic about what he just said, that he doesn't understand why Rule Britannia is important, just shows, amongst other things, amongst a very disrespectful attitude, and as you say, maybe he should take the time to bother to find out. If he had simply listened to the lyrics are, Rule Britannia, Britannia rules the waves, Britons never ever ever will be slaves. Now, what is this referring to? This is referring to what for many people is a glaring gap in their historical knowledge, which is the fact that it was the British Empire who stamped out the slave trade. And an even more interesting thing is that we didn't just stamp out the slave trade, within Britain. We patrolled the waves. We ruled the waves. We went out there hunting down slave ships. But there's a second part of this which I think is even more interesting, which is that slavery was a problem for Britain and for many European countries, not because we were doing it and it was an immoral thing, not at all. Because the Barbary slave trade over a few centuries captured more than 1 million white European citizens in slaving raids and kidnapped them and took them off into slavery. Now, a lot of people don't know this. Rule Britannia is talking about opposition to the slave trade, which Britain and later America are chiefly responsible for. We are the reason that slavery was stopped, whilst it continues in other countries to this day, something for which we never get credit for. And I just think it's so ironic that this young gentleman of mixed background would say that he doesn't understand why it's important. Well, it's doubly ironic because on the one hand, it's important because it is a song about Britain's triumph over the slave trade, but it's even more ironic because it encapsulates the other half of the question of slavery, which is omitted whenever it is discussed, whenever people talk about, even reparations. Well, we never talk about the fact that there were non-white people enslaving white people on a large scale, arguably on a larger scale than the transatlantic slave trade. So that's something that people need to be aware of. And I think if more people were aware of it, especially this young man, I think perhaps we would have a more balanced and a more reasonable discussion about, the legacy of slavery and the best way to address it.
Yes, but it also comes down to this same question of a lot of things about who we are, certainly from our imperial past. We've always been. So, for example, when he says, "Oh, I don't understand the importance of Rule Britannia," well, that's very strange because we've managed to understand the importance of it since 1740 when it was written. But all of a sudden now, it's being questioned like it's this enigmatic Rubik's Cube that's totally unsolvable. And oh, what does it mean? Oh, it's not really worth even looking at or examining, really. Isn't that just some crusty thing from when you used to go around the world broadsiding people? It's like, well, no, actually, it's a bit deeper than that. But also, within that rule Britannia, Britannia rule the waves, Britons never, never, never shall be slaves. It speaks to a sense that we on this island nation of ours, we are a team. We are on the same team. If you live here, you are on Team Britain. And increasingly, more and more people, especially those from backgrounds from around the Commonwealth who have come to settle here, and this isn't conspiratorial because they openly say it, but they are using past imperial action as a wedge to advocate for their own self-interested group preferences. And we here in the West are really struggling with this because for many, many decades now, we have been on the road towards meritocracy and fair play and tolerance and colorblindness. But whilst we have been on this ideological road towards aspiring towards these things, the rest of the world has not.
Indeed.
And so we're coming up against, they are arriving at a society that is attempting to deracialize itself, to look beyond, which is, to basically, in a very idealistic way, put away a lot of the tools that that our aggression were rooted in the olden days. But the thing is that these places have not looked past them and they still cling to seeing things in this exact prism.
Yes, it's a very complicated issue. And for me, this sort of opens up a whole landscape of things that we could discuss. And again, it's often difficult to know where to start. But I think just to kind of wrap up on the Rule Britannia point, what really strikes me is that it seems that any time British people want to feel good about themselves for being British, or English people want to feel good about themselves for being English, there's been a trend to demonize this and to criticize this and to belittle the people who do it and to call them, all sorts of horrible names like Little Englanders, or xenophobic bigots, or there's lots of horrible little names that they make up for these people. And I just think it's really interesting how, again, I want to point out to people there is a double standard here, because you can you can say things about, the identity of being British, or the identity of being English, or the identity of, dare I say it, being white. That can be criticized ad nauseum. But if you were to take exactly the same criticisms, the same sentences, and simply replace the word English or British or white with black or Muslim or Jewish, you would be cancelled. You would be criticised. You would risk losing your job. And I just want to point out to people, it's not that I'm saying that, oh, well, you should be able to say all of those things about black people or Muslims or Jewish people or whoever you like. What I'm saying is that if it's wrong to say those things to brown people or black people or any particular group, then logically it must follow that it is also wrong and bigoted to say those things against white people, against British people, against English people. If it's wrong to criticize a person because of their race and their nationality, then it's wrong, regardless of who it is. Otherwise, you are not talking about equality. And I think people should really let that sink in. If you believe in equality, then it has to be equal, regardless of which background you're from. If you don't treat people from different backgrounds the same way, and if you make an exception and you think, oh, well, it's okay because, oh, well, white people or British people or English people did some bad things, you're not talking about equality. I'm sorry, you have departed from equality. And now you might be able to say, oh, well, I can justify it though. Look at all the things that they did. We have to make amends for this. They have to apologize. We need reparation. You can say that. But you could equally say that for all of these other groups. And if you don't know that you can say that, if you don't know that other groups have also done bad things, that is nothing more than your own historical ignorance. And again, I must apologize, but you really need to learn more about history and about what groups of people were like. If you have this fiction that, the West was uniquely evil and that, all the other peoples of the world never did anything wrong, I'm sorry, you've just never read a history book. You know nothing. And it's not to say that we should persecute or criticize them. It's to say that human beings inherently have these flaws and these behaviors, and they compete and they fight, and they have been killing and murdering and raping and enslaving each other since the dawn of time. Either you want equality and you're prepared to say, look, we're not going to hold a person's ethnic background or their national background or whatever against them, or you're not. And if you're making exceptions for any group, including white or English or British or American or whoever, then you do not believe in equality.
No, no, this is entirely the case. But also, I think that something pertinent to add to that would be this speaks back to my previous point about whether it be certain sort of Hindu nationalists who now live in the country, or certain communities who've come from the Caribbean. It's always that, well, you did it to us, so we're going to do it to you. Again, it speaks to that thing that I was saying of we're trying to put this thing away, but just because we're trying to put it away and in our own way move forward in a more in a less aggressive manner than what imperialism requires, that doesn't mean that the rest of the world is going to do that as well. And also, it comes down to the same point. Well, you did it to us, so we're going to do it with you, to you. So, okay, so right, you don't disagree then with colonialism in principle, as a matter of principle. You simply don't like the fact that you were the ones that it was done to. And the moment that someone says, well, you did it to us, so we can do it to you, essentially, and I don't, it's hard not to sound radical, but I do believe this needs to be said. They are essentially telling you to your face that they are your enemy. They are saying to you, no, we are here to hurt you like you hurt us, is
Exactly.
what they are actually saying.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And I think it's important for people to recognize exactly what is happening there. This harkens back to what I was saying a little while ago about how, the question is, are you British? Are you English? Are you, you know, American or whatever? Is it simply a case of moving here and having the citizenship, and that's all there is to say about it? Well, when you come to these questions of, a conflict of interest between people of different groups, and you see the case of these people who are saying, well, actually, we are here and we are going to behave like this as retribution. We want justice, which means we want reparations. We want to take back what we think we. Well, the we that they're talking about, forget about whether you agree with them. The we is not we the British. The we that it's not we the English. It's not we the Americans. It's not we the Europeans. It's we the black people, the Muslims, the whichever. Well, who are they speaking about? It's important to find out. Who do they mean when they say we? They might use a modern, acronym like people of color, which has since gone out of fashion because it's then been noticed that it arbitrarily kind of groups all non-white people together as though they were all the same thing, which is quite a
Well, they have a term for that now, of course, which is global majority.
global majority. I hadn't heard that one. My God,
Mm.
what a thing!
Yeah.
What a term! And I mean, the thing is, again, it just shows that there is a double standard. And I think this is, if there's one thing about the message, I suppose, that we're trying to get out to people, and I do think it's worth thinking who we're talking to, who we're hoping, who am I hoping, who are we hoping is going to listen to this and take something away from it. Um, I really think I'm talking to people like me, people like us, English people, people who were born here, people for whom this is our home, this is our country, this is affecting our culture, this is affecting the land on which we live, this is affecting the people about whom we care, this is affecting us, we, because our we is we the British, or perhaps it can be we the English. We, some people would still say we Europeans. I think we know what we're talking about when we say that. It's a different we. We are a group. And it's important to acknowledge that. And it's important also to say that, well, we can acknowledge that fact without being convicted of any sort of bigotry or prejudice. Because apart from anything, we are identified by those group identities by the people who criticise the English and the British and white people. So by their own definition, we exist as a group, and therefore it's perfectly reasonable for us to acknowledge that yes, we do. But I suppose if we are to be addressed as a group, and if it is to be the case that people come here and then act not as though they are simply part of our group, but act in the group interests of these other groups to which they are still members, there is a conflict of interests. And I want people listening to this just to entertain the possibility that that conflict of interests impacts us negatively, and that for them to get everything they want will only be possible at our expense. And that being the case, I think it's important to consider what is at stake, what we stand to lose, and whether what is being asked of us is reasonable or fair.
And whether you would ask it of any other country, whether you would demand it of anywhere else.
And perhaps we could talk about some of the steeper costs of mass immigration, because we've talked about housing, we've talked about the additional drain on our infrastructure and on our resources, the NHS being a notable example. But there are other things which have got a lot worse since mass immigration started. These are potentially more controversial topics, so we will tread carefully. Again, I hope that people listening can enter into this in good faith and with as open a mind as possible. One of the things that I found most difficult to get my head around was in the sort of early days of my awakening to all of this, was what I started hearing about the grooming gangs in Rotherham. And I know that even by saying that, there are some people whose heckles will already have come up. There are some people for whom even saying Rotherham will instantly create a moral intuition of, it's one of those racist people. They hate brown people. This is not true. It's far right conspiracy theory. It's all. I've encountered this, and I find it, understandable, to be perfectly honest. Because when I first heard this, I couldn't believe it was real. I didn't think this could possibly be true. And then I had to know, and I started investigating it. And I want people to know that when I started looking into this, I was looking into it from the point of view of someone who believed that this couldn't be true and that it was just racist right-wing conspiracy theories. But I wanted the evidence. I wanted to see, I wanted to be able to really debunk it so I could be the one who gets in there and wins the argument and, looks great doing so and whatever. And I kept listening to people who were talking about it, and I kept learning more. And I kept waiting to hear these people say something that was genuinely racist, or something that was genuinely bigoted, or something that was an obvious lie. And the more I listened to certain speakers who we literally cannot mention by name because the YouTube algorithm will probably censor this. There is that much online suppression, a topic for another day. I kept listening until I realized that all of that attempt to dismiss, that they're just racist, it's a conspiracy theory, what have you, that wasn't true of what I was hearing. And I kept searching for it, and I kept not finding it. But what I did learn was horrifying. Now, the Rotherham scandal it's a difficult thing to get into. Of course, for anyone who doesn't know, it doesn't just apply to Rotherham. But what we're talking about is organized gangs of predominantly Muslim men from Pakistan and a few other majority Muslim countries who immigrated to this country, and who we know, because there have been police reports and investigations into this at scale, have been operating large rape gangs, child rape gangs. They have been grooming young indigenous white British girls, and some Hindu Sikh girls initially, Hindu and Sikh girls, although those communities, I think, were quite successful in fighting back against it. But this has been going on for decades at a scale which beggars belief. And I couldn't believe it, because I couldn't believe that something like this could happen in this country without, violence in the street, without pogroms. So this is a cost that no one should be expected to pay. And again, it's difficult to really get into the subject. I just want people listening to just entertain the possibility that until you've really looked into this, there's a chance that it might not just be a conspiracy theory. It might not just be some far-right nut jobs and racists and whatever. There might be some truth to it. And we can leave links in the description. I know there are people who've done great work investigating this. But I think that is a cost which it is not reasonable for the British people to be expected to pay for the benefit of there being mass immigration, for whatever benefits there may be to that.
Yes, and again, it's one of those things that it's never going to come to the doorsteps of those who actually implement these policies and allow this to happen. This will not, if it does become a concern to them on a personal level, they will be the last people on this entire island that it becomes a personal issue to. The thing is, though, that they are allowing something, they are starting something that they cannot control, because eventually it will get out of their hands. What if, hypothetically speaking, the population of Britain became 20% Muslim? Would that not be a large enough amount of Muslims in the UK to expect, through their right to freedom of association, to just create, say, the Sharia party? And what if the entirety of, hypothetically, say, Birmingham or Rotherham or wherever it may be, votes for that party? And these parties start getting MPs in Parliament. And so you have, somehow you've winded up in a system where someone, a Lib Dem, who gets elected down in some seat in Devon, is arguing with a man who got elected in Birmingham over the basic rights of what women's rights are in this country.
And you can only believe that
How
that's
did we
coming.
come to this?
Because, I mean, to put this in perspective for people, the Muslim population of Britain is larger than the Welsh population. Over 3 million at this point. And another point
Yes.
is we spoke earlier about fertility rates, i.e. the rate at which people are having children, and whether they're having children at a rate which means their population is going to grow or stay the same or contract. And whilst the fertility rates for the indigenous white British population are in steep decline, the fertility rates for immigrants tend to be well above replacement level, which means that they are having children at such a rate that the immigrant population is not just increasing through mass immigration itself. The immigrant communities are also increasing because they're having more children. They're having a higher rate of children than we are, which means that it's not only a hypothetical, it's a statistical inevitability. It's merely a matter of time, unless some massive change were to take place, until the Muslim population does have a large enough, they have enough size, they have enough votes to be able to wield serious democratic power in their own interests. And as Luca points out, if their interests are Sharia law, then you can forget about women's rights. Now, Luca, I'm going to suggest that we have a pause for perhaps a cup of tea or a glass of water, and then are you good to carry on, or?
Yes, I think so.
Okay, good stuff. So should we say 5 minutes?
5 minutes.
Should be enough for a decent cup of tea.
Oh, I think so.
Okay, right. I'll pause the recording and we'll come back in 5 minutes. Okay, and we're back.
We are just having a cheeky sip.
Cup of tea.
Oh, that's the best. That truly is the bee's knees.
What's your tea bag brand of choice?
Oh, Yorkshire Gold, of course.
Of
course.
Good choice.
The only choice.
Well, I've just been trying, what is it, Clipper Organic. That's also a good choice.
Oh, yes.
And Twinings is also pretty good.
Twinings are good. Yeah, if you go for any of those three, if you choose any tea other than those three, you've sort of gone off the reservation a bit. It's like, no, wait, stop, come back.
Yeah, you're missing out. You're missing a trick.
You deserve better.
Yeah.
So come back. Yeah, please.
I have to say the best tea I ever had was from a tea shop in Norwich, and it was a loose leaf tea, and it was Earl Grey. And there's this one tea shop in Norwich, and I can't remember what it's called, but there's probably only one tea shop in Norwich, and it just blew my socks off. I mean, the flavour of this tea was so rich, but then the amount of caffeine in it as well. I was wide-eyed. Everything was glowing. It was, it wasn't, over-egging it a bit, but my goodness, like loose leaf, if you really want to get into tea, then I think loose leaf is where you take it to another level. Anyway, we digress. Luca has a really good point to start us off again with.
Oh, well, so we were talking a little bit before we went and boiled the kettles about the idea that if you have other people with in-group preferences towards their own faiths or their own ethnic groups or their own sort of ideological sects, that essentially what you're doing is you're diminishing the sovereignty of the native populations to actually have a voice about their own country. And I bring as evidence of this. What China did when they conquered Tibet. Because when the Chinese armies moved into Tibet and the Dalai Lama obviously had to flee for his own safety and has since spent his entire life living in exile, what the Chinese did, because Tibet is a very, very small country, very, very small. And what the Chinese did was they simply gave incentives for millions of Chinese people to move to their new conquered territory, to move to Tibet. And the reason should be obvious to anyone why the Chinese decided to do this. It's so that the people living there would feel a loyalty not to Tibet, but to China. And so if you move one people from one place to another with enormous numerical advantages, then essentially it does simply become a numbers game.
That's a really good point, Luke. And the first thing that made me think of as well was if we think back to the mid-century Germans, there was the concept of Lebensraum. Now, for most people who've studied history, you will have looked at World War II, so you may be familiar with the concept of Lebensraum, which means living space, essentially. And this was one of the key ideas that drove Hitler and the Nazi Party. And this was that the German people, they believed, needed and deserved more space. So once they started invading countries like Poland and neighbouring countries and taking them over, they did exactly the same thing, where they had German families move into these towns and start, setting up shop, as it were. And it's exactly the same thing. They want to have their people there. And they wanted those, German families to have lots of children. And that was part of their view of how they were going to take over these vast swathes of land. And, we can look at the Nazis and we can see, well, yes, they were doing that. And the Chinese, you can make that comparison and say, well, they're doing basically the same thing. They are taking over a piece of land. And they are, to secure that piece of land, they are moving in their own population, who will cut with them. They will bring their culture, their values, their language, their loyalties, and then they will start to have more children, and eventually that will become, not just de jure but de facto their land, because they will be the majority of people who are living there.
Yes.
And so I think the thing to bear in mind then, if we look at how this might apply to modern day Europe and Britain and America and Canada and Australia, for that matter, is that the scale of immigration is going to have the same effect. Now, obviously, we're not saying that the Commonwealth countries or China or the countries from which these immigrants are coming have conquered us militarily. No, of course they haven't. But in the same way, having large communities of people moving in, or having large groups of people move in and form communities that are not integrating with the indigenous population and culture, but are in fact maintaining a bubble of their own culture, where their own language is spoken, and where they still operate with in-group preference, preferring to help those within their own group. Well, the problem there is that, it's only a matter of time until more and more of what was our land, which had our people living in it, and who embodied our culture and spoke our language, until that starts to change just by virtue of how many other people there are who bring these other cultures with them. And at a certain point, if demographic trends continue, if immigration rates continue as they are, with perhaps 1 million more people coming into the country every year, and those people then having more children than they need to replace their population increasing for that, whilst our population is contracting, then at a certain point we will become a minority group within our own country. Now, for anyone who thinks this is fanciful, I would direct you to well, Douglas Murray in his book, The Strange Death of Europe, references I think it's professor, the person who actually did some calculations for this and forecasted that by, I think it was around 2050, was it, Luca?
I
Thereabouts?
think 2066
Sorry,
is the number you're
2060.
looking
That's
for.
it. Thank you. 2066. By 2066, on current trends, the indigenous white British population of this country will be a minority ethnic group. We will be less than 50%. Now, if that sounds outlandish, people should know that anyone who was suggesting that that could happen in our capital cities a few decades ago was equally considered a kook. It could never happen. People never believed that London or Birmingham or any of the other major cities of this country could become, minority majority, as it were. And yet they are. London, if you only have to visit London and especially step outside of the tourist areas, to see that white people are now in a minority. And this is the same in Birmingham. This is the same in many, many, many countries, most of the major cities, I should say, in Britain. If we're already a minority then, this can happen. And on current trends, that will happen by 2066. So again, if we are seeing this trend of in-group preference being retained, and being retained because the scale of immigration is such that these people are not integrating, but they are preserving their own culture and continuing to act primarily as a member of that group that they came from, rather than having integrated into the indigenous population, well, at a certain point, whether it's a democratic system or anything else, if they have the numbers, they will be able to exercise more and more power over this country. And what will they do? Will they continue with our values and our institutions and our ways of life? Or will they continue doing what they are doing now, which is to prefer and preserve their own culture, their own ways, and their own people?
And what's peculiar about this is that invariably it will get to the point where it's an affinity for a culture and a people from a land that they've never even been to themselves. I think that one thing to point out here as well is that when you look back at the history of the British Empire and the way that Britain conducted its affairs, there are places where we obviously had a lot of people move from Britain to other nations or lands, whether they be the American colonies, whether they be Australia, whether they be South Africa. And invariably the story is the same. Once the colonists became so great in number that they outnumbered and had the power to subjugate the native populations, whether it be the Indians or the Aborigines or the Zulus, they did it. But in places where that, such as India, where we didn't start to demographically replace the Indians in India, the British Raj was governed over by an elite British aristocracy who came over as regional governors from Britain. But invariably, their administrative state was made up of native Indians. And when Britain left India, and India gained its independence, you can see, even to this day, that there is not a tremendous amount of cultural damage that has been done to India. And since its independence, India still governs itself as Indians, by Indians, for Indians, because everyone there is still Indian. They don't have millions and millions of British people living amongst them who are constantly trying to still somehow subvert them or have British sympathies. And it's so within the very same empire, our empire, you can see how we did things differently and how one led to now a very sovereign, very nationally binding country like India compared to somewhere like Australia or America, where those native cultures have now been subjugated to nothing, really.
Yes, it really shows that the thing that defines the nature of a country is its people.
Yes.
And you might say demographics are destiny. Um, Now, again, I just want to perhaps again reach a hand across the aisle to people who might still be listening to this, and their moral intuitions are telling them that, maybe we have a few good points, but there's still something that they feel isn't right about this attitude of negativity towards people from other cultures, and that, trying to frame things as though they're a negative effect, it is immoral, because they're human beings. We shouldn't judge them. We shouldn't criticize them, and all of that. Um, I want to suggest one way that perhaps you could think about it, which is, you could say, if you imagine, a recipe, you're cooking something, and you want to add, if you don't add any salt, it might be a bit bland. So perhaps having a little bit of salt is just going to set off that recipe, and just going to add enough interest to the flavour so that it's really enjoyable. But if you just keep spooning in more and more salt, it's going to become unpalatable. And the only point I'm trying to say there is, it is about the scale. And this is why it's a very difficult question, because for anyone listening to this, when we talk about mass immigration, what you're actually going to think about is, well, who do I know? And if what you're thinking about is the people you know in your life who were not born in this country, but perhaps they're people that you work with, perhaps they're your colleagues, perhaps they're your friends, perhaps they're more than your friends. You think about these individuals, and you think, well, probably you get on with them fairly well. Maybe you don't. Maybe you've had bad experiences. But a lot of people who, are thinking of a few people that they know and like and value as human beings, are still just going to find this a very difficult topic. And it is difficult because, legitimately, if you are thinking about a person that you know and you're saying these things, the implication is that, well, what are you saying? Are you saying that you want me to move out of this country? And on an individual level, that's a very difficult thing to even contemplate. Expected that of any human, regardless of, what the issue is. So the point is, if you really want to take this situation seriously and fairly, you have to look at it at scale. You have to consider, well, what are the implications going to be if we carry on along this course? And the current course we are on will take us to a point where, as we said, by 2066, if not sooner, well, we will become a minority in our own country. And the people who are going to gain political power and, living space in this country, they will be taking up more homes, they will be using up more resources, they will be influencing everything in the direction they want it, which, as we've said, there is a conflict of interests there. If they want Sharia law and we don't, well, it depends on how many people there are if we're voting on it. This is going to get to a point where we, within our own home, lose control, and then we are at the mercy of these people. And I think that's really worth considering. Whilst there may be some difficult questions of how to reconcile this with your day-to-day life and, with the people that you know and care about and work with the idea of what this implies at scale, I think the only alternative is literally burying your head in the sand, putting your fingers in your ear and saying la la la, and just pretending it isn't happening. And, for anyone who is invested in the future, for anyone who has a family, who has children, or who wants to have children, and who values the people they know and love, their own family, their friends, their culture, the people that they grew up with, and values the continuation of this country and this people, this is an existential threat that we cannot turn away from. It's there whether we like it or not. Now, I'm not suggesting what the solution is. If I had a solution, perhaps I would start a political party and just say, here's my manifesto. No, I'm not saying that the answer is this, that, or the other. What I'm saying is that we have to address the issue and we have to admit all the facts and acknowledge and factor in all the implications. Because if we don't, those things will just happen the way they're going to happen. And that could well be that things turn out such that we lose our home, we lose democratic majority, we are disenfranchised politically in our own homeland, and then we're at the mercy of whoever's living here and however they want to run things. And that might mean that they change everything in a way that makes life, in some cases, it could be unlivable. Some people might not want to live
Yes.
under Sharia law. So it's a conversation we have to have.
And I think the thing as well, on a personal level, for me to say on this point is that I don't like feeling this way. I get no sense of personal satisfaction about having this view of the world. I actually find it quite, I find it, one, it's enormously demoralizing to see the slow drip, drip and the evaporation of your entire ancestral way of life disappearing around you. But second of all, it's the case that I wish I believed idealistically that there was a path towards unity, that 20 million people with more coming we could just assimilate them in a few years. I truly, truly wish that were the case. It would be easier for me to wake up every single day and think, you know what, things are going to be okay and things are going to work out all right. But the fact of the matter is that everything that I've read, everything that I've listened to, and every person that I've spoken to on this is a reflection of this is what has brought me to the views that I have about this subject matter. And I don't like coming to that conclusion, but I feel like it's a far better conclusion to come to and to accept the truth that this is a very slippery slope and a very dangerous future that we're getting ourselves into, rather than just waking up every day, maybe going for a pint at the pub and going, yeah, it's all just going to work out. Someone else is just going to sort this out. Unfortunately, I think that this requires us to get involved. It requires participation. If we want to see the machinations of our politicians stopped, those who have done and continue to do this to us, then we have to get involved, because the truth of the matter is that no one is coming to save us from these problems. They agree with these problems. They want us to face these problems, and then they want us to submit. And I can't do that. And even if I die at the age of 85 in a lovely little armchair, I won't have it said that I did nothing. Even if we fail and all that I fight to defend is in vain, then at least I can get to the end of my life and say, well, at least I tried, as opposed to, well, I just thought someone else would do it.
Yeah. And I think it's probably difficult for people listening to this who perhaps are starting to see that we are saying a few things that they're agreeing with. I don't know if there are some people who may be on the fence. There might be some people who are not so familiar with the fact that there are actually people like us who feel this way about things and are, passionate about it and want to talk about it. So I think the thing I'd want people to know is there are a lot of people like this, and consider the possibility that all the nasty things you've heard might not be true. So we're all familiar with the all the bigot labels that get thrown out all the time. Racist, sexist, homophobic, transphobic, xenophobic. You could go on. You could probably list 30 or so of the common ones, and it's used to shut someone up. Basically, anytime someone's saying something that you don't like about that involves a group, for example, you can just come in and say, "Oh, they're racist, they're sexist, they're this, that, and the other." And what that does is it serves the purpose of demonizing the person saying the argument and dismissing their argument out of hand by saying that the person is only saying that because they're a bad person, they're immoral, they're harboring prejudices. It can't be true. It's not true. They're only saying it because, well, what? Because they just hate people from different groups. That's the implication. And most people seem to go along with it. Although you've got to understand that people who don't go along with it face, losing their jobs at the extreme, but fierce pushback and themselves being tarred and feathered. So I know that a lot of people agree with us out there, but are just too afraid to say anything because they know the risk they run. And I think that's why it's important for us to put these ideas out there and to speak about them, even though we know that a lot of people will want to demonize us for what I'm saying. Because I think if you can get to the point where you can actually think this through for yourself, and you're not hampered in your thinking by all of these labels that you can't listen any further because this is a bad person and we've told you so. If you're actually able to get rid of all those labels and actually consider the ideas for yourself, as I did, as Luca did, as all the people who we know who have actually come over to our side of things have done, you will then find yourself looking at the whole picture. And you may find that once you are furnished with information and facts and arguments and ideas and implications that no one has ever told you before and that you've only ever heard being demonized, you may find that there is more to this than you might get if you only got your news from the BBC or the Guardian or the mainstream media. You may find that actually you have been living in a very limited conceptual world that's designed to blinker you and that's designed to control your thoughts, your feelings, your outlook. It stops you hearing about certain things, and it influences you. It tells you how it wants you to feel about things. You should really pay attention to the moral tone of voice in which the BBC presenter, talks to you. Yeah, they're talking down to you. They're talking to you. And there's an implication in the tone of their voice about how you should feel about this. So, really, I'm not trying to kind of hard sell anyone on anything. What I want to do is give people the whole picture, because I think it's only when people have the whole picture that they're going to be able to come to, an accurate view of things on any of these very important subjects.
Yes, and I think that to extend an olive branch to those listening who perhaps have generally disagreed with a lot of what we've said so far, and if you are listening and that is the case, then I only thank you for sticking with it and the charity of your time to persist and allow us to try and articulate our concerns. But even if you disagree with it, with what we're saying, vehemently, then please just understand that this comes from our concerns come entirely from a sense of wishing for safety and protection and a strong sense of community about us, that we're not some sort of atomized. We don't want to live in societies that are individualized and atomized to the point where you're just some sort of interchangeable worker who's here on a student visa. There's actually, or a work visa or whatever it may be, but you're actually here because you feel rooted to where you are in the world. You have an affinity and a love for the things around you. And I think that once it's gone, it's gone. It's not coming back. And when, so we have a choice. Do we wish to continue as a people, which is a reflection of the true diversity of the world, true diversity, which is the diversity of strong cultures living their own strong in their own strong communities in Germany, in England, in Russia, in China, in Papua New Guinea, in Argentina, wherever it may be. That is the diversity of the world. But the moment that you mash all of those diverse elements into one city, then it doesn't mean anything anymore. And no better example of this can be found in London, than our own capital city, because the mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, continually says the mantra that diversity is our strength, diversity is our strength. He never gives any explanation as to why it is a strength. And London seems to inexplicably become more and more dangerous, with more and more crime and more breakdowns of communities. And what Sadiq Khan is actually saying when he says diversity is our strength is that diversity is my strength, because without diversity, Sadiq Khan is not mayor of London. And this, I really feel very strongly about this point.
It's a very good point, Luca, and I think that kind of ties into, again, this central concept that's come up in this conversation of identity, of who are we. Diversity is our strength. Who is he talking to? Who is he talking about? Who is included in this our? If diversity is our strength, he's referring to us, a group. But I think, it's pretty clear that we certainly think that when he says diversity is our strength, he's referring to everyone except Indigenous, English, British, Londoners. It's the strength of, as you say, him, because if you look at who voted for Sadiq Khan, this has actually been done. If you were to overlay a heat map of the diversity of London, i.e. of which areas in London have a larger number of people who are not born in this country, if you overlay that on top of a heat map of where the vote went for Sadiq Khan as opposed to anyone else as a candidate, you will see that the map of diversity and the map of who voted for Sadiq Khan are the same shape. He won because there were more people who identified with him as an immigrant who themselves were immigrants. And so diversity is our strength. Perhaps that is a diverse group of people. They must come from many different countries, but they seem to identify as a separate group from us. So if you're a white, indigenous, British person and you think diversity as our strength includes you, think again.
Yes, it doesn't. And also, one of the points to make about this as well is when you look to as a window into his ideological view on this matter, he gave £25,000 to each borough of London to basically have an inquisition into what road names, what statues, what place names, what places of history in London are acceptable in this new diverse London. And so essentially, but what self-respecting true Britishman would put their own history on trial like that and decide which is the good and which has to go? And the point about that as well is that London is the capital city of Great Britain. And I, as a small child growing up, always wanted to go to London and see the capital city of my country. And when I get on a train and go down to London, I want to see the people and the place names and the statues that are part of that national story. It's not just about London is bigger by virtue of it being our capital city than just its own inhabitants. It is supposed to be the fulcrum of our entire country. And the entire country does not look like London, does not share London's newfound, new age, diverse values. And so we are sort of at a position now where our capital city is kind of at war with the rest of the country.
Yeah, and it's important to point out that it doesn't look like the rest of the country yet. But again, on current trends, that changes. Is only a matter of time. Um, and again, exactly, it goes right to this question of, well, whose capital city is it? Which country? If we would say they're replacing our statues, they're replacing road names commemorating our ancestors and the great figures of our culture. But from the point of view of Sadiq Khan and his, strongly diverse group, while they don't see themselves as part of that group, they actually dislike that group. They want to replace us in our own capital city and our own homeland. They want to replace our culture. You can just look at the number of mosques that are being built around the country, in London especially. They're not coming and integrating into our faith, such as the church is still at this point. They're bringing their own culture with them, and what seems to be happening everywhere is that we are being replaced. And again, I feel that these questions are so charged. There is so much put out there to try to make you feel a certain way about these issues, and to feel that anyone who questions this is just an immoral, evil, nasty person who just is hateful for no reason. That it's difficult to talk about this rationally, because I know for many people it will be a moral and a very emotional question. You will probably have strong feelings evoked just by these questions being raised. But there's the famous saying from, it's Ben Shapiro, who is admittedly a very conservative American commentator, that facts don't care about your feelings. Now, this isn't to invalidate your feelings, but this is to say, if what you care about is the truth of what's going on here, then I think putting aside your feelings, admitting that you have them, and that's fine, you can acknowledge them, but to say, well, yes, I feel this, but the question remains, what is true here? And if we look at the facts are that our demographics are contracting. The number of indigenous white British people in this country is only going to go down. And conversely, the number of immigrant people arriving here, and people who are, the children of immigrants, is increasing exponentially. And it's just a matter of time until we become replaced in our own homeland. And I think, it's worth people contemplating this real possibility in our future, in our near future, in a future that we will, most of us listening to this, live through ourselves, of what that's going to be like, and what that's going to be like for our children and for their children. What sort of country will they live in? And I want to suggest to people that we have a duty to pass on the country, the culture, the values, the land, the institutions that we inherited from our ancestors. We have a duty to safeguard and pass on all of that to the next generation. And if we allow that to be taken away from us, whatever the reason, then we are failing in our duty to our next generations.
Yes, no, I agree very much with your thesis, shockingly. The I think the thing as well, there's just one more point that I'd add on that, which is that this is not to say that there are not people who have come from abroad or necessarily been born here from an immigrant background who have not in many ways become the model immigrant. There have been success stories in all of this, but they are few and far between. And the exemption does not prove the rule. And it's very, and those people are out in the public sphere, constantly mixing with the whole of society. But there are entire districts and boroughs and ghettos that do not mix or go outside of their own community, who spend their entire lives living in Britain but never grow up speaking or learning or acclimatizing a British accent and always continually speak with a foreign accent. And you can go, and I have done this. I have walked around areas of London through the streets where I've managed to go from one side to the other without hearing a single word of English. And so I come back to the point that this communities born and raised here have seen everything about their lives changed with not a single word of consent put to it. And I think the consent is the most important thing here, because we supposedly live in a democracy, but we were never asked about this, one of the most important issues in this country's history.
Indeed. Although to kind of take it one step further, there were certain times when we were asked, in the sense that there were polls taken of British public opinion over the years, but in every single poll that has ever been taken about British attitudes towards the prospect of foreign, immigration, and certainly mass immigration, the overwhelming majority have opposed it. So it's important to understand that the demographic changes, the mass immigration of over 20 million people, with more coming every day, this has been done against the wishes of the British people. This has been done
Yes.
against what the democratic majority want. And so you've got to ask yourself, well, who is it who would see what the polls say? He would understand that the majority of people in this country do not want these changes, do not want to have people move in for whatever reason, and will do it anyway. He will go against the democratic will of the British people. And why would they do that? What would motivate them to do that? Because it certainly isn't acting in the interest of democracy or of the people of this country. So I know that the phrase that we were never asked. It does. I don't think it goes quite far enough, because we were asked and we said no, but they did it anyway.
Yes. Yes, this is. Sorry, I've got a bit of a. Yeah, no, this is entirely the case.
So
And so
we've
I,
been going for, I think, probably approaching 2.5 hours now.
my
Do you want to
goodness,
keep going, or do you want to wrap things up? How are you doing?
I think that rounding up would be an excellent idea, but I'm more than happy to come back and do it again sometime soon.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's been a great conversation. I feel like there's so much more we could talk about. We could get on to just the general trends of decline in this country, and
Mm.
why they're important, how they're impacting people's lives in so many ways, and also, importantly, what people can do to counter those trends, and not necessarily moving to change the whole country, but just within your own life, what you can do to secure yourself against some of these things and to retain some meaning and value. in your life. So yeah, I think it would be great if we come back another time, maybe, come back to it fresh with another cup of tea and and
Yes.
just have another chat and see where it goes, because I think this has been a really interesting and insightful conversation, Luca, and I really appreciate your time as well.
Well, thank you for your time in turn.
Okay, well, thank you to anyone who has listened to this all the way through. If you've made it to this point, then thanks for listening. Wherever whenever you were when you started listening, and whether or not we've managed to, shift your views on anything, or simply added more information to help you to make an informed decision about how you feel about these issues. Thanks very much. We really appreciate your time. At this point, I'm not sure what platform I'll have uploaded this to. If it's a YouTube thing, obviously, if you want to subscribe, you can, and maybe we'll do some more videos. If you don't, that's fine. If you want to like it, you can, otherwise not. It's up to you, really. I know everyone kind of mentions that at this point. But yeah, hopefully, I will be putting out some more content through whatever channel this finds its way to. And if it continues to be interesting and of value, then hopefully people will keep listening. So thanks very much, everyone, and we'll see you next time.